Welcome into a very special edition of the TDN Fantasy Show, a live stream edition of the show. Chris Schubert, Jaime Eisner here with you and doing something a little different. If you've been following the Draft Dude saga on Mondays, we've been opening, hold on, Jaime, let me get some of these here for you. We've been opening these Panini packs on the show, and we've been doing 3-round mock drafts for the players. So you came to me today and you said, you know what? You've got those cards, you've got those packs. Why don't we put a little fantasy spin on it? So while I get everything ready to go, I got a lot of cards here to my left. Tell everybody what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what this process is going to look like.
So I blatantly wanted to find a way to rip off the Draft Dudes' idea here. Of course. So I tried to figure out, put a little fantasy spin. So what we're going to do is Chris is going to draw cards at random from the Panini pack. Now, they're all going to be offensive-related players. That's the one thing I gave to Chris, that he's got to just cull through them and make sure quarterbacks, running backs.
You sure you don't want to rank Khalil Mack or any fantasy
No, I'm not doing, we're not doing IDP type of conversation.
All right. Just making sure.
Quarterbacks, receivers, running backs, tight ends. Okay. I don't know what they're going to be ahead of time. Chris doesn't know what they're going to be ahead of time. He's going to pull a card at random, and then we're going to talk about that player's current, way too early ranking for me as we head into April, and discuss a little bit about the player and some of the fancy things we're thinking about. We're going to do this every Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern. This is our pilot type of a show.
Yes.
So I'm really looking forward to this because it gives us a chance to talk about a lot of different players. It's hard to get into. There are so many really good fantasy players, so many people that have individual questions or their favorites. It's tough to get into for a couple podcasts a week, or just on the mock draft shows, or just in the writing. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about a wider breadth of players as we lead up to the season this year.
So we've opened a lot of packs on Draft Dudes. I got a lot of player cards here. So I just literally earlier today put all the offensive players in a pack, and I pulled out 5 of them at random. Okay, so I have I think 1, 2, 3, 4. I lied to you. I have 6 cards in front of me here for today's show. So here's the stack of cards. So just like I show on Draft Dudes, I will show you these cards from the Panini packs, and I'll pull one up, and then we'll talk about that player, their fantasy value, and whatever other conversation may stem from it. So here you go, Jaime. Player number 1 here for you. I will bring him up to the camera.
Roll, please.
Saquon Barkley.
A way to start, because I already know that I am going to be out on an island in the fantasy football community when it comes to Saquon Barkley. I've discussed this on the show before. Right now, which you can actually, as you are watching this tomorrow morning, the rankings of running backs will be up on the draftnetwork.com. I decided to put them up a little bit earlier than this weekend. So if you listen to the TDN Fantasy audio podcast,
Jaime lied to you there.
Yeah, I just flat out lied. I'm putting them up a little earlier. So running backs are coming out on Thursday, receivers on Friday, tight ends on Saturday, quarterbacks are already up. Just go to the fantasy tab at thedraftnetwork.com. But enough plugging. Let's talk about Saquon Barkley.
Don't filibuster, okay? Talk about the man on the card.
I got him 12th. And I know that is way out there. I got it. I know the fantasy community is really ready to put him back at full price. I'm seeing him as high as RB3, coming in RB4, RB5. I want to pull up this very interesting stat because I mentioned it inside of my way too early mock draft I did way back when I started, actually back in 2020 still, and updated it every week. Here's a very interesting stat that Fantasy Labs was able to come up with in 2015, and that is, and I'm going to read this for you verbatim. Okay. Since 1999, running backs coming off ACL surgery have produced right around 2/3 of the fantasy points on a per-game basis as their pre-ACL selves. That is very interesting. So I looked at where I had Saquon Barkley last year, who was my consensus RB2, and I think it was across the board. I'm not breaking any new ground there. Kind of looked at where his projections were, and then I put, let's use that 2/3 method. That brought him back into that 14.5, 15 fantasy points per game range, which is still darn good, but you're looking at more of a low-end RB1, elite RB2 type of production there instead of what we've been getting. Now, I try to factor in that Saquon Barkley is an athletic freak, that he's just he's working his butt off to get better and back, and we have seen some guys have success. Adrian Peterson is the one, you point to right away. With a little bit of time, guys even Jamal Charles has had a ton of fantasy success post ACL surgery. But I get a little bit concerned in year one. And to me, the fantasy community is buying back in on early ADP at full price. They're taking him as if he played the entire season last year and put up top 5 running back numbers. I can't pay that price right now.
No, and I think that's ultimately where, and we've had this conversation about Saquon before, that you knew ahead of time that you were going to be a little bit lower on him than most, because his ADP in most spots is, in that top 5. And I just don't know how you can anticipate him being a top 5 level player. You're assuming that he is just going to be the same player that he was 2 years ago, and you're okay paying a premium for that risk. Just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to take on that risk. Just doesn't.
And it's a phrase I use a lot on our podcast, but I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to be wrong here. I'm not going to spend a top 4 or top 5 pick to gamble that I'm going to get a 100% Saquon Barkley, who now has a major ankle injury and a major knee injury on his record over the last 2 years where he's missed significant amount of time. I'm just not going to be the one to do it. I realize that means I'm going to have exactly 0 shares of Saquon Barkley this year. And you know what? I'm comfortable with it. I'm at peace with it, Chris. I can put my head on my pillow at night knowing that I think I'm going to be okay not taking the risk on Saquon Barkley. And if he's a top 5 running back, I will applaud him. I will give him all the credit in the world and say, you're a tough SOB, but I'm just not going to take that risk myself with a top 5 fantasy pick.
Yeah, and I also think there's the question mark of how he's going to be used in the offense, right? Just because he's back and he's able to contribute, they may not want to push him. I will continue to say this. There's now a 17-game schedule. There's an extra game on the calendar. That's going to change the way workloads are structured throughout the week. So I don't know if you're going to be just immediately, even if he's 100% healthy, you just put him right back in and give him the same workload that he got 2 years ago. They've completely revamped this offense. They've added a bunch of weapons. They're more than likely going to do so in the draft. And I think it just changes the way the offense is going to be structured. So I think it's a wait and see approach. And because it's a wait and see approach, plus the injury stuff, I think you're spot on. I maybe would put him a little bit higher, but I certainly agree with your overall logic of you can't have him inside the top 4.
So let me ask you this, Chris. Don't look at running backs, for example.
Just I don't have the list in front of me.
Overall, just draft. Where do you feel comfortable taking him? So I had him down in like the latter portion of the second round when I did this way too early mock draft. I'd probably move him up a half a round, but for me, I feel very comfortable saying I wouldn't take him in the first round.
Yeah.
If you're picking 12?
That's the only spot I'd consider.
At the turn.
Right.
And if consider that
snake format, or I'm going back to back, and I can immediately then turn. I take a little bit of a risk with Saquon, but then I can turn it into a known commodity with pick 1 of the second round. Yeah, I think that's where I feel really comfortable with it. I think I feel right. That's really the only place that I would consider. Maybe 11 in snake formats, because then you're coming right back around and only 2 other players are going to come off the board. But other than that, I can't justify seeing 4 or 5 players come off the board before I pick again and having Saquon Barkley be the guy that I come away with in the first round. I just can't. I can't justify that. Okay, I got another player here for you. I've pulled the card. Show it to the camera.
Yeah,
Mark Andrews.
Very
tight end conversation.
Very, very interesting. So I think this conversation is going to center around. Like Chris. Let's just talk about like process of elimination here.
Okay.
We agree on the top 3 tight ends, right? In whatever order you want to put, it's Kelsey, Kittle, and Waller, right? There's no debate here. We don't have to have this discussion.
I would agree. Yes, we are in agreement.
So normally there would be like undisputed Mark Andrews is number 4. We're not talking about it. I think he's number 4 for me. I should say, I know he's number 4 for me right now. I think Kyle Pitts might be in this conversation. This is, I know we're coming right off of Kyle Pitts' pro day right now as we're talking about him. All the hype is there, but
what are you on a 440 this morning?
Putting him in Atlanta with Matt Ryan and in Arthur Smith's offense, putting him in Cincinnati maybe as another weapon for Joe Burrow.
Miami.
Really? I'm not as excited about that.
No, I mean, he would still be a premier option there.
Sure, but I don't like the quarterback throwing him the ball there. So we'll see. But at that point, it becomes a little bit of a difference. But to me, this is whether or not you're taking Mark Andrews tight end 4 or tight end 5 for me. So for right now, I'm taking him tight end 4, but there's a significant gap for me between the top 3 tight ends and where Andrews lands. So, for example, I had Darren Waller coming off the board, and I'm searching this right now for you guys in real time. I had Darren Waller coming off the board. I didn't mean to shake it like that. Okay, Darren Waller's coming off the board at the middle of the 3rd round.
Okay.
I had Andrews down there towards the end of the 5th. So, I think there is a significant gap talking about the overall draft from these guys, like more than 2 rounds.
Put Pitts in that spot. Does Pitts close the gap in that tier, or is he still in that same tier with Andrews and it's a similar?
No, he's in the same tier. Like right now, I would have Pitts 1 spot behind him. Right now, I had a Pitts ranked as my tight end 5. I know it's not a card that came up there, but to me, that's its own little tier. And then there's some other guys I like down there afterwards. Like I think Noah Fant's interesting. I want to see how Hawkinson does with the new quarterback. There's Mike Gesicki's and so there's some other pieces down there that intrigue me. But right now, I think there's like a 2-man tier in the second tier of tight ends, and it starts with Mark Andrews, and right behind him on his heels is Kyle Pitts.
Okay, I got another player here for you. I pulled this one from the top of the deck.
Oh, okay.
Derrick Henry.
Okay. So I have Derrick Henry, and I was pretty happy with where I have him here as my RB3. I think it's weird when you have to start talking about tiering off these elite options, because as you look through the top 4 in particular, there are kind of a couple different tiers here. Like I think I would feel very comfortable saying that Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey are my top 2. And I don't really feel like I need to deviate off that for really any reason. And we're talking.
All right. Well, this was one of the cards in the pack, so I'll take this guy and I'll just put him to the side then, because you're kind of just giving it away. So we'll just put him over here.
But they're 2 and 3. Like, to me, I have Christian McCaffrey 2. If you want to have him 1, I'm not going to argue with you. I think it's razor thin. I just still have some concern. It's razor thin for me. But they're clearly 1, 2. Then I think the next tier is Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara. And I think the reason why I feel comfortable with Henry over Kamara, and I talked about this a lot on the TDN Fantasy podcast before, there was a significant points per game production drop for Kamara when it was Teddy Bridgewater or Taysom Hill as the quarterback when Drew Brees was out. It was better with Teddy Bridgewater than Taysom. So it gives me a little bit of excitement that if Jameis Winston ends up being the guy, that at least Kamara can have a very strong top 5 running back season. But I don't think you're going to get like the stellar level of production that you've seen from him for the last couple of years. Derrick Henry, I still think, despite the pieces that are missing in that offense now, there's a new offensive coordinator. You're going to have a new wide receiver 2. You're going to have a new tight end 1. He's still going to get the ball constantly. He's going to get the volume. He's going to get the touchdown volume, which is huge. I can't see a case to be made for really not having him in that 3rd or 4th spot. So that's kind of where I have Derrick Henry right now. I don't imagine he's going to move much. I'd be more concerned about, let's say, Tannehill's fantasy value for this season because of some of the weapon switches and the OC switches than I would be for Derrick Henry.
Yeah, they're still going to run the ball, and they're still going to run the ball a lot. In late in games when they have a lead, they're going to give him the ball. That we've seen it over the last couple of seasons. That's what they do. That's why he's able to have those ridiculous games where he's going over 200 yards, because they'll just turn the ball and hand it to him in the backfield, and then let him work, because that's what he does. So yes, I think to your point, the OC change I don't think impacts him, because I think it's pretty easy. If you're the new offensive coordinator coming in, I think it's pretty simple. Give the ball to Derrick Henry. Should be priority number 1 on your play sheet each and every week. So yeah, I agree with you. All right, Jamie, I got a quarterback here in front of you.
Oh boy.
Are you ready for this? I don't know if you're ready for this.
Should we talk about McCaffrey first, or?
No, I put his card to the side. You basically gave
it
away. And so, I mean, I'll show the card again for everybody so that they can see the lovely card.
Sure, a nice Panini card there.
There you go. There's Christian McCaffrey's
what
card.
What pack is this from, Chris?
This is an assortment. I took all of the cards that were given that we've opened on Draft Dudes, and I put them all together. So you got all sorts of different packs. I'll show you the different. We got the illusions that are represented in here. We've got the Panini contenders that are represented in here. We got the optic. We got all sorts of different stuff in here.
Optic. That's what this one is.
This is the Christian McCaffrey optic card. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to a quarterback, and it's Russell Wilson, Jamie. It is Russell Wilson that you get to talk about your ranking for him. If you missed the quarterback ranking show that we did that dropped earlier today, we go into a full deep conversation about this. I don't think we're going to rehash the entire thing here, but Jamie, Russell Wilson, explain yourself.
So this is great. So I'm actually pulling up my notes from the podcast earlier. So if you listened to the TDN Fantasy podcast earlier, thank you very much. If you haven't, please go do it now. Anywhere where you can listen to your podcast. There's another cheap plug right there. Very good. I have Russell Wilson down as my QB 10. And I know this infuriated Jake Arians. I thought playfully, but he was kind of mad.
Yeah, I thought, he was upset with you.
He's going to come through the screen and hit me. No. So Here's what my logic is on Russell Wilson, because I know there's going to be a precipitous gap between, he was hanging around the top 5 in average points per game last year. He was going at QB 3 or 4 in fantasy drafts a year ago. This feels like a precipitous drop for him. I have some concerns with the second half of the season, and I brought this up before. I brought this up with DK Metcalf. I brought this up with Tyler Lockett. I brought this up while this was happening to the Seattle Seahawks on the podcast. There was a very stark, almost baseball-like mid-season split switch where you had such a great first 8 games of the year for the Seahawks. Then things really started to tumble for that offense, and Russell Wilson was a part of why. I'm not going to say he's the biggest reason why, but he was a part of their struggles. From week 10 on, he was the QB 15 in average fantasy points per game. behind Ben Roethlisberger, who started that descent with Pittsburgh, behind Mitchell Trubisky, behind Andy Dalton. Like, this was what the value you were getting out of Russell Wilson there. And my question for him is going to be, will they continue to throw as much as they did last year? Threw a career high 558 times last year, which is about 8% more than the year before and 23% more than the year before that. So the question is, if they do want to have this recommitment to the running game, and this is what Pete Carroll has talked about pretty much since the end of the Seahawks season, are we going to go back to more of like a 510, 520 attempt? Now, I'd have to prorate that over an extra game, but are we talking that sort of a level of like, what is it? We're not going to do math here. So I'm going to use my handy dandy phone here. Are we talking more like 32 attempts a game? Is that kind of where we're looking for Russell Wilson? He'll still be successful, but he's going to end up being 60, 70, 80, 100 attempts behind some of these guys in front of him that are more, the more traditional passers, not like Jalen Hurts, for example. But I think he's in this kind of glut of like, he's still in that QB1 territory, but he's not a priority for me. Like, I don't think he's clearly not going to, at least in my estimation, he's clearly not going to be inside of the top 5.
Yeah, when we had this conversation on the pod this morning, my only issue with your ranking of Russell Wilson was that you put Jalen Hurts in front of him, right? That was kind of one of the issues that we hashed out on the show. But I don't think anything you said there is inaccurate, right? Because they're changing offenses, because we saw what they wanted to do in the second half. I just don't think there can be the expectation that they're just going to sling it all over the place and he's going to be able to put up that type of production. And you have to follow the numbers. You have to follow the math, and you have to follow your eyeballs. And the eyeballs and the math tell you that if they try to do what they did in the second half of last year, Russell Wilson is not going to be a top 8 quarterback fantasy-wise. He just isn't. No,
and my concern here is, it's going to go, when I do all of my projections, which are still coming this year, the second year of the Eisner board for TDN premium members, where I do all my 200 plus player projections.
Now you have a 17th game to consider.
I do, but it's going to be very interesting of how I decide to kind of figure out all of these Seahawks players, because if I project them to do what they did in the second half, they're going to look a lot like what they did last year. And I took a lot of heat for my rankings, but like, they were right for half a season. They were completely wrong for the first half. I get it.
Yes.
Do I kind of find a mix there, which I think is more likely to happen? That I think that's more likely going to be some sort of a combination of what you probably saw as a whole, maybe a little bit shaded toward the second half of the year. But I do have some concerns for the DK Metcalfs, the Tyler Lockett's, and the Russell Wilsons of the world for fantasy, because I think people saw what they did in the first half, especially if you didn't have them on your teams personally, and maybe missed the real tough games that happened literally from week 10 on.
I have one other player from the main pack that was pulled at random before the show. But while you were talking, I figured, you know what, let's get some more players involved. So I have in front of me, Jamie, I'm not going to tell you who they are. I have a quarterback, I have a wide receiver, and I have a running back. Which position would you like to discuss? And then I will show you that player.
We haven't talked about a wide receiver yet, right? Okay. So let's talk about a wide receiver.
Okay. All right. So I will tease some of the players that might come later, because these are the players you passed on. Lamar Jackson, Cam Akers. Those are the players you didn't talk about. Maybe we'll talk about them at a later date. Maybe they'll enter the randomness. This is the wide receiver that you decided that you wanted to talk about. Odell Beckham Jr.
Boy, there's a lot to discuss here. Obviously, he's coming back from a major injury. Apparently, he's doing well. He's tweeting that he's doing well, because everybody thinks every time
second
he tweets,
act, right? Yeah.
He's
going back to the Giants every time he tweets. Yeah,
I know, right? I have him right now at wide receiver 36. I'm of the mind that I think actually the Cleveland offense is better when Beckham is out. And that's not an indictment of Beckham's talent. I think it's just an odd fit. I've kind of fully bought into Baker tries to force it to Odell Beckham Jr. more than he should, and it makes the offense less efficient. And that doesn't mean that Baker's a bad player. It doesn't mean that Odell Beckham's a bad player. Obviously, those are not the cases. But that's kind of the scenario that we're in. People really, really, really want to get that New York Giants production out of Odell Beckham Jr., and that's gone. It's not going to be there. The quarterback situation, the offensive situation isn't there. I'm not sure he, with all of the injuries that he's faced over his career, is going to be that type of player anymore. He's going to have some big games here and there. He's a player that you probably want to put a little bit of extra boost on in best ball formats. But to me, he's a low-end wide receiver 3 in a group of wide receiver 3s that I think is probably 25, 30 deep. I know it technically can't be that, but there's a lot of variance there. And, kind of some guys I have around him, I have him like a DJ Chark, a Jamar Chase, a Cortland Sutton. Like, I think all of those guys are in that sort of range alongside Odell Beckham Jr. I just think his name value is always going to get him overdrafted, and it's always going to have people have ideas of grandeur that he's going to return to that elite wide receiver production that he put up in New York.
This is going to be the year. This is going to be the year that Odell gets back, and we just haven't seen it. You're right, and I think to expect it all of a sudden to click after all this time, especially coming off of a major injury, right? Like of all the years, this is not the year that I would raise my hand and say this is the year it clicks. Right. And I just, again, to your point, I don't think that Giants production is ever going to come back. That doesn't mean he can't be a productive wide receiver for you in fantasy. It doesn't mean he can't be a productive wide receiver for the Browns, but you have to then adjust your expectations. You can't just look at, again, I'll show the Panini card once again. You can't just look at the name on the card and say, oh, he's going to be a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2. I just don't think he is that anymore, and you have to adjust accordingly. And let me take this back to a conversation we had earlier, Jamie, about Saquon Barkley. Yeah. If because you are adjusting your thought process to say, I'm not going to buy into the name value, you have to be okay with then getting 0 shares of Odell Beckham Jr. because he's going to be overdrafted based on name. You just have to be okay with that. You can't reach for the guy just because he's going to be good wide receiver 3 value. You can't reach for him, though. You cannot fall into the trap that I think a lot of other people are going to fall into. Jamie, I have one more card.
Okay.
It is also a wide receiver.
There we go. Okay.
It is Adam Thielen.
Okay, so Adam Thielen is one that I'm kind of struggling with, to be perfectly honest with you, trying to find a good spot for him because I think touchdown regression is coming and it's going to come and hit him hard. And so I want to, I don't want to ignore what he did last year. But he had a career high 14 touchdowns. He finishes the wide receiver 11 in average fantasy points per game. I still think he's going to be a red zone threat. I still think he's going to get his, but he's no longer the wide receiver 1 on that team in my estimation.
I was just going to say he's the second best fantasy wide receiver on that team.
Well, I think he's probably the second best real life receiver too.
Yeah.
I think Justin Jefferson is a more complete, as he is growing now, a more complete receiver than Adam Thielen is. And Thielen's good in his own right, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not knocking him, but I think he's going to come down off of that. Again, not really bold here that I don't think he's going to score 14 touchdowns again, but I think we're talking about a significant touchdown downgrade from him, which puts him more in that like middle of wide receiver 2 territory for me. I have him at wide receiver 18 right now, kind of between Amari Cooper and Kenny Golladay. That's kind of where I feel comfortable putting him. I think he's somebody they still want to target, but I think if you're going to buy in at last year's production, I think you're going to be disappointed. And I know there's a little bit ups and downs with him, but I mean, he could be a 10 touchdown guy. I wouldn't be shocked by that, but I don't think we're going to be pushing teens here.
Yeah, and then when you have that touchdown regression, though, you have to make up that production somewhere. Those points, fantasy-wise, have to come from somewhere, either in the form of more receptions or more overall yardage. And Jamie, to your point, he's the second best receiver on that team. Right? Justin Jefferson's going to get the ball thrown a lot his direction. So I don't know if all of a sudden the target share is going to increase in a way for Adam Thielen to where he can make up that production, right? It's always hard to replicate touchdown numbers anyway. But again, if you're going to decrease in one area, you have to increase someplace else to even out and be in the same place you were last year. And Jamie, I don't see his target share going up in a massive way to overcompensate.
No, and again, it might not go down significantly either. But again, just cut 4 touchdowns off. Talking 24 points, and
you got to find those 24 points.
Season, that's a point and a half ish per game,
so
which will drop you down from. Again, we're talking about dropping him from wide receiver 11 where he was last year to wide receiver 18. Like I think that's a fairly reasonable expectation, even if he drops for a handful of touchdowns. So, he's a guy that I still like. If I can get him as my wide receiver 2 and put him in there, he's still in my top 20, but not somebody I'm targeting up anywhere near that like top 15 range. Like I don't know I think last year was probably his best case scenario nowadays, and he was still the wide receiver 11. Like I don't think he's somebody, because if I'm looking at some of the guys I have around him, if you want guys you want to talk about like true like upside, a couple spots ahead with like Terry McLaurin or Amari Cooper with a healthy deck for 17 games, or even Kenny Golladay if he's healthy inside that new offense. And you start to look at some of those guys and you go, Thielen might have a floor, but he doesn't have the same ceiling that some of these other mid-level wide receiver 2s have.
And he doesn't have the same ceiling that he used to, right? I think the combination of both of those things is what allows him to fall to wide receiver 18. The floor isn't as big, and I think the ceiling is much bigger. Specifically, Terry McLaurin is one of the names that you've thrown out there. I think the ceiling on him is huge in that offense with Ryan Fitzpatrick next year. So I would not be surprised if exactly what you said panned out. All right, that's it, Jamie. I'm out of cards for this week. We got to save some of them. We're going to do this every week here for the next couple of weeks. So I got to save some of the cards. I'll just run through them real quick so you can take a look at them one more time of all the guys that we discussed here on the show. There's Adam Thielen, Odell Beckham Jr., which Jamie had a great time talking about. Russell Wilson made all the Seattle Seahawks fans angry. He kind of mentioned Christian McCaffrey, so I'll show off the card again because we didn't really get to have the full conversation about McCaffrey. Derrick Henry got some love. Mark Andrews got some love. Saquon Barkley got some love as well. So we're going to continue to do this. We're going to go through all these packs that I have. Listen, the cards are all over here, off camera here. There's loads of them. And so I pull them. I get them all organized for us, and then we can have a nice little conversation here fantasy-wise about the value of these guys here for next season. And Jamie, I will come to your defense once again. Jamie reserves the right to change these rankings at any time. These are his way too early rankings for next season.
And they will change. I will do full player projections, stat projections. You'll be able to see basically me showing my work on how I get to some of these rankings. So these will change. A lot of them are going to change post-draft, where we know some of these rookies are going to be and which veterans might be at risk of losing their job. But I thought it'd be a fun exercise just to kind of get this going right now. And I think it's important to have a baseline to work from. We talked about that when we did the way too early mock back in January. It's good to kind of keep these baselines so you're not making these wild swings based on hyper momentum. Kind of know where these guys should be and then adjust them as new information happens.
Yes. So thank you to Panini for sponsoring this, giving us the packs to be able to go through and open all of these cards. Jamie, before we get out of here, tell everybody where they can follow you on social media, where they can read all of these rankings ahead of time so that they can get into the comments, tweet at you, get really angry at you with where you have their favorite players. You can follow me at Jaime Eisner on Twitter, at Jaime Eisner TDN on Instagram, and then on the fantasy tab at thedraftnetwork.com, you will be able to see all of these rankings. The quarterback rankings are up right now. If you're watching this on Thursday, you'll be able to see the running back rankings. On Friday, the wide receiver rankings, and then Saturday, the way too early tight end rankings. So they will all be up there. So it's top 35 quarterbacks, top 50 running backs, top 60 wide receivers. I don't even remember how far I went with the tight ends. I think maybe 25. So all those will be up at thedraftnetwork.com. Just check out the fantasy tab or at TDN Fantasy on Twitter. Yes, and at TDN Fantasy on Twitter is where you can find the podcast. If you don't rate, subscribe, you should do that anyway. You should rate, follow, and subscribe the podcast so you can get these episodes, because we're going to be doing these rankings. We're going to be going through Jamie's rankings. Jake and I go through them with Jamie, ask some questions. There's a big discussion. There's debate about where Jamie puts a player. The quarterback one, a fascinating discussion that dropped today on Wednesday when we are doing this show. So you can check that out, and you're going to have running back ones, wide receiver ones, tight end ones as well coming down the road. Also, a little bit of a sneak peek here for you guys. We're going to be doing a mock draft on the show next week. That should be a lot of fun. There surely won't be any arguments about that when we do the show. So you can look forward to that as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Shoe Radio, SCHU Radio. But again, TDN Fantasy on Twitter and thedraftnetwork.com, the fantasy tab for all of these rankings. Thanks so much for tuning in with us here tonight. We will talk